Good evening. I'm giving the last commentary to lecture 31 of the Foundations of Esotericism. I looked back and discovered that I started this journey on the 21st of March with everyone. And if you have followed these videos so far, it would be interesting to make comments below to tell me whether you've managed to continue the journey throughout, to have you sort of watched the videos and read the lectures, or just watched some of the videos. I started these videos in this time of lockdown because one of the spiritual realities that I work with is that the great counterbalances to things like pandemics and all these things that are overtaking us, our personal authorities to do spiritual work together. So my intention was to create a possible way for people in isolation, in times where we were not able to meet together in community, to continue doing the work. And now, nearly 4 months later, we've come to this 31st lecture, the last lecture of this particular group. And if one wanted to continue with the reading, there are 3 volumes of more esoteric lessons that Steiner gave in his theosophical years. They are very interesting and also very deep and meaningful to follow through some of those teachings. However, if one looks at the context of this particular lecture cycle, you would also see them that, you know, this particularly last lecture has a very interesting focus in the journey of the 31 lectures that he did over possibly a month and a half. We've taken 4 months to get through it, but yeah, it's very interesting that within the, you know, this is the end of 1905. In the early next year, 1906, he was entering very deeply into his understanding of the Christ being and lecturing, starting with the Christian mystery, and then entering into a dozen years of exploring the biblical books and the revelations coming out of the spiritual worlds and the reappearance of the Christ in the etheric world only a few years, 5 years later. So this is kind of a doorway with this particular lecture course, as we have said, is a doorway from his work with the Theosophical Society. He's exploring the Eastern esotericism, the Western esotericism, and Christian mysteries, or Christian esotericism, and finding a way. And in this last lecture, he really comes down to the central point of what he calls the turning point in time. So throughout these lectures, he's gone from really broad brushstrokes of consciousness, form, matter, substance, and how that works. And we've gone through all these various wonderful projections of evolution and how the evolution of consciousness takes place. And now he's really focusing in this last lecture. I'm not going to go through all of it in detail. I've just reread it this evening because it's been some time since my last commentary. But it's really worthwhile rereading it and just seeing how he really picks up our time, this time that he calls the post-Atlantean time. So from about 7,000 years ago, and even earlier, when people were streaming out from the old continents of Atlantis, and how they settled and started to create the 3 Asian post-Atlantean cultures in the ancient Indian or the pre-Vedic culture, so not what we call Hinduism, but 7,000 years ago, the consciousness of oneness that came over from Atlantis, and then the ancient Persian culture also in Asia that dealt with time, but also then starting to deal with good and evil, and then the Chaldean Egyptian times coming up to the Greco-Roman times, and how out of Atlantis, so if you remember back, if you've been following these lectures, that the 5th Atlantean epoch were the original Semitic people, so not the Semitic people of today, but this impulse of the Semitic people, which is the people who, as he says, discovered thinking. So the birth of the intellectual thinking in humanity and the evolution of consciousness starts in Atlantis. And that reaches a certain pinnacle in what he calls the Semitic Greco-Roman epoch, which then moves over into our time, the 5th post-Atlantean epoch, which in a way is the culmination of this time. And soon, in a few thousand years, we'll be preparing yet another huge cycle into the 6th. So he's really pushing it now, saying, well, how does this thinking unfold? How do the various streams that have flowed out of Atlantis through Western Europe, through Northern Europe, through Southern Europe, through Asia, how they all move into each other, how the Mongols come in, how the Huns come in, how the Moors come in, all these various influences on thinking, but that ultimately we see coming out of the three Asian cultural epochs, so the ancient Indian, the ancient Persian, and the Egyptian Chaldean epoch. They send forth out of their mystery schools the one who is to in a way birth the real central point of our evolution of consciousness in the intellect, and that is in the culture that had the responsibility of birthing the intellectual thinking Abraham. And he talks about how the Hebrews, we can follow through the Hebrew Bible, through the Hebrew scriptures, the Hebrew stories, this wonderful transition into the birth of how history and how consciousness is now influenced by the intellect. He brings the example of Jacob and Esau, how the trickery, how what we meet in our time is using the intellectual cleverness to get what we want, is already coming to fruition in the Hebrew stories. So we see Isaac and Esau, and then a real transformation into our time with the initiation of Joseph and then Moses. So seeing within the development of the stories how this intellect starts to govern a particular time within our unfolding, rather than a religious story. They're stories of the evolution of consciousness, and tracking for us in symbolic mythological stories the birth and the influence of the intellect upon culture, coming out of the Semitic work, coming out of the Semitic impulse coming out of ancient Atlantis. And this is I suppose maybe one of the more delicate comments one needs to make. It is not about anti-Semiticism. It's not about the Semitic delicacy that we have to take into consideration right now, because it goes back to much more of an impulse within the evolution of consciousness known as the intellect. And that's why it's also precious to us, really. And if you look at the delicacies around that, and all the reactions that we have around whatever is being said about it, it actually is quite personal regardless of our descendancy, because Semitism is really the intellectual work of the human being, which is quite interesting to see then where the sort of the cunning and the intelligence and the possessiveness of knowledge is really influencing our sort of times now. But then he really brings us out of that there is a time where that is then brought to a fruition through where the thought, where does he say this? He says that in the Greek and the Roman civilizations, which are the accompanying sort of civilizations around the Hebrews, that through this time this comes to a certain brought to a certain fruition through all the various cultural impulses. In this lecture he talks a lot about the various flows of culture. In fact, one of his more salient points that I've tried to follow through in my own studies, that if we want to understand history, we should understand the migration of peoples. And even in our times, the migration of peoples is incredibly convoluted, and some of it's voluntarily, some of it's refugees, some of it's running away from a thing, but people are moving across the earth in groups, repopulating, resettling in other places of the time, even to this very day, that when influences come, and even just say, for example, where I'm living, the migration of African peoples from the center, from the heartlands of Africa, moving now right down there, the South Sudanese people, cultural influence right in the heart of Melbourne today. So our real response to that, all these things, when people migrate and move into other cultural areas, the friction that is caused by different cultures meeting is really a part of the evolution of consciousness. In fact, his concluding words of this whole lecture cycle, he says, whatever we may experience, one can look with complete trust towards the future. For just as the crystal first develops out of an alkaline solution, only after it has been vigorously stirred, so also something new can only develop after great upheavals. So 2020 is certainly proving to be a time for most people in the world of great upheavals, certainly here on the east coast of Australia, starting with the bushfires, and then we've moved beyond the bushfires now into various other expressions of of having to really reconsider how we're living. These are times of great upheaval, and the times of migrations of peoples are great upheaval. And he talks about how 2,000 years ago, through the migrations of the people, that the Greek and the Roman and the other cultures that were interacting with each other in this place called Galilee, which was basically a melting pot of culture. It was non-Hebrew, it was non-Judaic, it was part of the Hebrew state, but it was actually a diaspora of multiculturalism, and that's why the people of Jerusalem didn't particularly like the Galileans. But into that, there's a certain fruition that comes. He says this. So the civilization of Greece and Rome both became great just through this personal element. So that this whole thing of the development of the personal attributes in the Hebrew stories, that that we understand the evolution of consciousness through personal stories, that reaches a certain pinnacle through Greece and Rome, and it comes to a fruition until it becomes incarnated and is elevated to the height as it appears in the Christ. So quite interesting that the Christ story then at the very end of this lecture cycle becomes so central to Steiner's own searching of how he can find a language between the Eastern mysticism or the Eastern esoteric, the Western esoteric and the Christian esoteric. He really comes down in this last moment saying there is something really important for us to understand in the mythology, in the myths, in the stories, that then in the personality of the Christ Jesus also is really important for us to transform. And interestingly enough, he talks about how some of these myths that we then may have more connection to is that Achilles, who is the Greek hero who is immortal or invulnerable and has a weakness in his ankle, but Siegfried in the sort of central German or the northern mysteries has a vulnerability between his shoulder blades. And that this, he says, this invulnerability, this is an interesting symbol to consider, that this invulnerability that Siegfried had between his shoulder blades was then in a way made or the vulnerability, that Siegfried had between his shoulder blades was made invulnerable by the one who carried the cross on his shoulders. So these symbols that we have, Steiner then in the next year, 1906, starts to work with this process of how do we use the mythological symbols, the mythological stories, meditatively as a way of personally developing our spiritual attributes in the evolution of consciousness. So he moves shortly after this to say that the word Christ needs to be given a new name, that we need to give the Christ a name which is the I am. So any person who can say I am has a certain universal, mystical Christ Son Spirit aspect to within themselves. So the incarnation of the intellect, the incarnation of consciousness into the individual person has really been part of the last, let's say, 5,000 years of evolution of consciousness, specifically through, say, from the Axial Age, 700 years BCE, where Christ brings a certain turning point towards how we can unfold that. So he really asks us to consider at this point the centrality and the importance of the Christ images in that story towards the evolution and the spiritual development as a foundation for our esoteric development. So even though Christianity has gone through its own problems in becoming churchianity and has been, in the 4th century, been taken into an exoteric understanding that has made a lot of us reject its understanding, in its essence, we see in Rudolf Steiner biography, the end of this particular lecture cycle lands up with him saying we really need to consider how this great Sun Spirit has accompanied the development, the evolution of consciousness, and with a particular turning point in our time 2,000 years ago, where the incarnation of the Christ into the personality of the human being allows the intellect through us individuals, through our I am, through our capacity to be an individualized spiritual being with our own opinions, with our own thoughts, to develop towards doing all the work that he'd been speaking through throughout this particular lecture cycle, which is, how do we lift the veils of consciousness back towards seeing the spiritual worlds and really naming that the power, the force within us known in Christian esotericism as the Christ being, is very central to understanding that, and in a way begins his journey of taking the understanding of the Christ away from the churchianity forms that had come about at the end of the 4th century. I could at this point go on and on forever about this theme. Hopefully it's enough to spark your interest in exploring how we can find a mystical Christianity. I mean, a couple of years beforehand, he had given the lectures in Berlin under the sort of the questions and the help of his future wife, Marie Sivers, about Christianity as a mystical fact, and now he starts to explore what this really means. But these particular lecture cycles in 1904 and 1905, he's still refining his own thinking on hand of his training in Eastern esotericism and taking the theosophical and the Eastern esoteric words and starting to create a framework for which we now in the Western philosophies can also participate in understanding the mystical aspects of the evolution of consciousness again. So without going on for much longer, as I said at the beginning, I would love for my own feedback to see how many people have managed to watch all the videos or read all the lecture cycles read all these lectures over the last 4 months and watched the videos. Have you gained anything from it? Just from my own personal interest, that during these times doing spiritual work in this way together, using media in this way, can also be quite meaningful to create a sort of insightful counterbalance to the fear-based thinking that's predominating. Okay, wishing you well. I don't know if I'm going to do another one of these. 31 lectures has been a really long time. I should have really thought that through before I started. But yeah, we've been going for 4 months on this lecture cycle, and I've really enjoyed it and gained much insight myself in reworking each lecture through to a little presentation. Okay, cheers.